Colleen Stover from Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and executive producer of the Space Policy Show. Recently, Space ISAC, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, along with Aerospace Corporation, hosted the third annual Value of Space Summit. Space Policy Show was there to record our episode number 107 from the event. We caught up with experts from across the sector, from MITRE, Astroscale, Applied Physics Lab, University of Colorado. We had outtakes and key takeaways from experts of these organizations, along with Aerospace and Space ISAC, of course, talking about the different elements at the summit. One of those outtakes was with Lori Gordon from the Aerospace Corporation and Erin Miller, Executive Director of Space ISAC. And these two women have such a great rapport. We wanted to be sure to bring you their full outbrief, their full key takeaways from this 3-day summit. They did something similar for the second annual summit that we did capture for episode 74 of the Space Policy Show. So here they are now talking about the third summit.
Hi, I'm Erin Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the Space ISAC. Space ISAC is Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and we host an event annually called the Value of Space Summit. It's co-hosted with the Aerospace Corporation, and Lori and I and all of our team have been working very hard to make sure that every year we're able to incorporate a broad conversation about what is the value of space? What's the value of our space systems? How are we using space systems? How do we anticipate that growth as we move from terrestrial interactions with our satellites to cislunar and beyond? And the commercial sector is burgeoning, so we have lots of great dialogue every year with the international community and our government partners and everyone who is moving through school right now and interested in addressing cybersecurity for space. We include cybersecurity because the ultimate goal is to move from a conversation about the value of space to sustaining space systems to securing and protecting our space systems.
Awesome. Erin, yes, thank you. And it's been fantastic working with you the last 3 years on the Value of Space Summit. And we've had 3 broad themes across the 3 years. The first one was securing the value of space. And then we discussed in the second, protecting the value of space, and now sustaining the value of space. It's really sort of congealed really interesting conversations, really around a framework of 4 different lenses that we're looking through. So one is focusing on policy, one is focusing on the market economy, also technology, and then the international scope. And knowing that those are always evolving, they're interdependent, and so ensuring that we have a broad range of topics. Panels are very diverse. We're having a lot of, from subject matter experts to key strategic decision makers across the government as well as in the commercial sector. So we're bringing a wide range of topics, conversation, and people to the table. So glad to support you in this endeavor.
Yeah, it's such a great partnership. We lined up some really intense panels with some great subject matter experts. We covered topics like cybersecurity for space workforce, space systems as a critical infrastructure sector. We talked about the intimacy of sharing and how we can look at cyber threat intelligence best practices and incorporate that into the space sector. And then one of my favorites, of course, that was brought on this year is the topic of cislunar and cybersecurity for cislunar companies, and how our new emerging space industrial base is really going to need to examine how they incorporate cybersecurity best practices before they go planning their mission to the moon.
Yep. And we had a lot of conversation in terms of across those 4 key lenses I was just discussing in terms of technology and thinking through, the whole focus is on information sharing and partnerships. We can't get to the technology or the policy or better understanding the market economy without those 2 key principles, information sharing through partnerships. And so one thing that we kind of discussed, we had a fireside chat this time, and they discussed the importance of moving from opacity to clarity in information sharing and gathering, attribution, et cetera, et cetera. And when you think through that vertical of the technology solution, it's really how do you bring the kill chain to that? How do you move progressively to identifying, exploiting some of those risks across the either the acquisition lifecycle, the full development lifecycle, et cetera, and using technologies such as artificial intelligence, neural networks, things like that, to really define, scope, and mitigate some of the threats that we're seeing through that information aggregation, analysis, and remediation.
Yeah, on that note of information sharing, there was a lot of conversation about how we do risk management for the space sector and how we continue to grow our information sharing capabilities from a public-private partnership perspective. And as we evolve both of those conversations, then Space ISAC is at the forefront of this conversation. So we're driving conversations with our federal government partners and had a significant amount of contribution from FBI, ODNI, DHS, U.S. Space Command, and U.S. Space Force in all of our conversations the entire 3 days of this event. And it's been really fantastic to see that public-private partnership congealing. I think you used the word congeal as well. Yeah. And we Aerospace rolled out the SPARTA framework. And so some people might be thinking, well, what does SPARTA framework have anything to do with public-private partnership? But in the Space ISAC Watch Center, you have the public-private partnership converging, and we're going to leverage the SPARTA framework along with MITRE ATT&CK. So when that got rolled out, it was kind of like this milestone moment. People may not realize the gravity of what's happening here. And now we have actually a tool to track TTPs and APTs for the space layer and the spacecraft, which MITRE ATT&CK partnered with SPARTA is a great solution that we're going to employ on our analyst dashboard in the Watch Center.
Absolutely, and so you listed a lot of different government agencies, and a lot of those are sort of new to space. So that's been fascinating that Space ISAC has really been sort of a launch pad, an accelerator for moving maybe non-traditional actors into better understanding what is their future role in space as we lift off from a terrestrial, focus to cislunar, as you mentioned. We'll talk about that a little bit, and beyond. So, what is the security role? What is law enforcement role in space? Things like that. And so SPARTA, right? The tactics, techniques, and procedures. I think the other key question is that we're able with this partnership to not only work with senior level decision makers, but also down to the operator level, the people on the front line. And so they're using these tools that we're able to develop, in theater, where it's really those tactical decisions are being made that will shape the course of a lot of future events and how we mitigate some major risks across the board. So that's really good. We also talked a lot about norms and normentum. How do you build momentum around norms? Just sort of a take on that word. And we talked about some of the norms that have been established that just by default. And one of them, Brandon Bailey, one of our senior cyber security researchers, was just mentioning that there's really no more shaming of a company that comes out and says we've experienced this attack, this cyber attack, we have this vulnerability. And so that's a real sea change because there's a lot of everyone thinks about proprietary information, sort of their business model. They don't really want to reveal some of their challenges they're having. But I think Space ISAC, through its information sharing and partnership, has enabled that cross share of information that's so key. So that if one company is seeing a vulnerability, that can alert others that they need to watch for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We heard that in the innovations and satellite launch panel. I was really impressed with how once asked the question, what do you do about monitoring for vulnerabilities and disclosure of those vulnerabilities, every company walked through the process and was willing to explain on stage that as they're preparing for a mission, then they do a vulnerability assessment of their systems and they report at least internally of any findings, and they're willing to suspend the mission if they're finding vulnerabilities. Otherwise, they're going to be on like hour 1 or counting down to launch or whatnot, and they're going to have to terminate then, and no one wants to do that. So that was a great discussion and really great to hear from the space sector on their position on cybersecurity.
Yeah, exactly. And then as we move into cislunar, we had a lot of discussion this event about that. And what are those? How are government agencies really stimulating the commercial market around that area? So we talked about LunaNet, which is a NASA approach to really define sort of what the framework looks like. What are they looking for? What's the art of the possible almost? But and sort of defining the what. But having the commercial sector and industry better define the how How can we get there? So really being creative in more ways than ever, I really feel. So that's been great. So we'll have some really unique capabilities, building that capacity, and leveraging the workforce as we see it, the technology, et cetera. So.
Yeah, and we did hear the commercial sector's interest in actually exploring the South Pole of the moon. So not even driven by federal government interests, but by the commercial sector itself getting into cislunar. It's remarkable.
So sustaining the value of space, some would say it's a little bit of a loaded term, but because it means so much, but you can unpack it. One way I like to think about it is, how are we ensuring the future of space enterprise, of the space market opportunities, really focusing on what is the business case for space. And that comes through all of the different dimensions that we discussed through, day 2 of the session yesterday, Value of Space 3, VOS 3. Really looking at cislunar. How do we better understand what are the market opportunities there? How do we build the technology to go to cislunar? How do we build the infrastructure to get there? What are the enabling policies, can't forget about policy, right? Technologies, influencers, even looking outside of the space market, but to other influencers, including, energy, transportation. Do they have any lessons learned from these other sectors? Because essentially what we're looking to do is everything we've built here on Earth, whether it be, infrastructure, the enabling infrastructure, or the policy dimension, all of these key factors, the norms, really what we're looking to do is translate that to space. And so it's really looking through all those different lenses that we discussed earlier, market economy, policy, technology, and the international dimension, really with international norms, to make sure that we're all really in lockstep, that we're going in the same direction, we have sort of the same vision, and we're not going sideways on certain things, because if we go sideways, we really won't be able to sustain sort of that longer term vision.
One of my biggest takeaways from Value of Space Summit is that when we titled it Space Sustainability, our goal going into the conversation was to get people to talk about cybersecurity as part of sustainability, because ultimately that's what our goal in Space ISAC is to share information about threats and vulnerabilities, and that leads to a conversation about sustainability. So if we can't protect our space systems, they're not sustainable. And I really walked away feeling like people are embracing this conversation, all aspects of it. They're willing to incorporate cybersecurity into their space systems curriculum in universities. They're talking about how the cislunar and the new emerging space industry has to adopt cybersecurity best practices. And we're looking at how to integrate space threat intelligence sharing with cyber threat intelligence sharing. So we're moving in the direction where it's not just a conversation like you're saying about normentum, or what is that word, Lori?
Normentum.
Normentum, yes, I love it. But embedded in normentum is cybersecurity norms, and safety combined as one topic. And my next step from this is to really start to have that conversation from the top down, because we have a lot of people across the industry now who are concerned about this, and they've recognized to protect our space critical infrastructures across the world, from terrestrial impacts to space layer impacts to beyond, and our national security, we also need to have this conversation at a level higher. We need to be talking about what is the policy that we need to put in place to align our public sector partners to support the industry. As commercial leads out and we have a $1 trillion space economy, that's driven by the commercial sector. It's not driven by government. We have an inverse model now, and so that's where we're headed. Is we've got to start talking about this at a higher level and setting policy and direction.
I agree. And when you think about the future, we talked a lot about 2040 and what does space look like in 2040. This summit this week. But you also have to think about the next gen. And next gen, I always think workforce. And so we're doing a ton, locally here within Colorado Springs, across the country, even internationally, to make sure that we are, providing the tools, processes, information, technology that's emerging right now to students, in any capacity. Just so that we know that, because the future is about the workforce. And so making sure that they're aware, they're being creative in, decisioning processes, and creating sort of multiple paths, I guess, to get to the future, but then we can also make sure that we're developing the right criteria, but to better understand, well, what is the right future path if we can do that. So, yes, agree.
Yeah, and so we have some other great next steps too. Space ISAC is running a tabletop exercise at AIAA Ascend, and one of the takeaways from the Value of Space Summit is we've got to put these things into practice. So we're seeing all of the different moving pieces going into practice because we're working these elements all at the same time, concurrently, truly. And I'm really looking forward to now including more of these aspects, looking at cybersecurity for the ground station as a service, including more contribution from government partners and the international community, and informing some of the future policy for space sustainability, including cybersecurity.
Right, and I think, on that point, thinking about some of the best practices, lessons learned that we've already gained going forward, that is part of our future vision, our future architecture. So making sure that we embed those across this lunar, as we move into all these different dimensions in space, that we're leveraging what we've learned. Don't let it go, but ensuring that it's baked in, across the acquisition life cycle, the development life cycle, things like that, in terms of technology, but also making sure that we're including policymakers. Legislation is going in the right direction, that we're moving, appropriately forward. So all of that.
Yeah, I really feel like the cyber vulnerability lab that Aerospace has been helping Space ISAC design is going to help with this too, because we'll be able to partner with all of the vulnerability labs that maybe the Air Force has and the Space Force have and NASA have across the nation and industry. But in the Space ISAC vulnerability lab, we're looking at the commercial perspective and what does the commercial sector want to see for cybersecurity, and a lot of the threads from this summit we can pull right into that lab and start doing testing beginning next year.
Agree, and you make a good point that we, in some cases, things have been built up separately than others in terms of different labs across different agencies. But how can Space ISAC use this, be the lever to knit those together, that they're sharing this information? So it's great, that there are these separate. There's been, the motivation to build these labs, but how do we knit them together, sort of into a cohesive threat picture that becomes an opportunity picture for where we can go.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so looking forward to next year.
It's going to be fantastic. Boss 4, everybody should be there.
Boss 4, we'll see you next year, same week.
Thanks, everybody.